Well, hey there, and welcome to Conversations, where today we have Yannick Jacob, who is a coach, trainer, and supervisor with a master's degree in existential coaching and applied positive psychology. He is part of the teaching faculties at Cambridge University, the International Centre for Coaching Supervision, and he's the course director of the School of Positive Transformation's accredited certificate in integrative coaching. Yannick presents at conferences internationally, and his book, An Introduction to Existential Coaching, was published by Routledge. Committed to helping other coaches be the best coaches they can be, Yannick founded and hosts Yannick's Coaching Lab, which we're going to talk about, which gives novice and seasoned coaches an opportunity to witness experienced coaches live in action. He's a podcast host, which we're going to add those definitely to the show notes so people can connect that way with you. And for all you strengths enthusiasts, Yannick leads with adaptability, strategic, relator, communication, responsibility, and woo. Yannick, welcome to the show. And where in the world are you today?
Kelly, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm in Berlin at the moment. I'm based here now, so
Yeah.
I'm always elsewhere. Home is where you are, I guess.
That
And
it sure is.
yeah, I love Berlin. Great vibe, great city. If anybody hasn't been, I really invite to soak it in.
I would love to visit. I really would. My mother's been there, and I would love to visit someday. So I will look you up and we can connect. Well, I reached out to you. I saw you on LinkedIn, and it was something around ethics. And that really piqued my interest, especially as a coach. And I know that there can be times where it's a sticky place when we think about ethics. So I'd love for you maybe just to share a little bit about what ethics means to you in coaching and why that's important for coaches.
Yeah. There's a quote I really like about ethics, which is by Michael Carroll, who wrote a lot about ethics. And it goes, much is revealed about a person's, I would say a coach's character, that by what appears or doesn't appear as an ethical decision.
Mm.
And to me, that has been so true, right? What's an ethical decision? Well, essentially, we're talking about what's right, what's wrong, right? If we have it in that polarity. But everybody who's been thinking for 5 minutes about what's right and what's wrong probably realized it's a bit more complex than that. You know, very often there's a huge amount of gray, or it just depends on the context. It can be very challenging to navigate. And then also, by what standards do you decide right and wrong? Is it the law? Is it morals, culture? Then culture isn't necessarily the area where you live in or the country you live in, the part of the world, but the house down the road has a different culture. The team next door has a different culture. The classroom on the other side of the hallway has a different culture. This friend group has a different culture to that friend group. This coaching relationship has a different culture to that coaching relationship. So, it's really very tricky to navigate what's right and what's wrong, what's the right thing to do here. And I think one of the things I want to say straight from the bat that I think is really helpful and also makes things more complex. So sorry, and you're welcome, is that ethics isn't a set of rules to follow, like the ICF's code of ethics or, AC, MCC, every professional body subscribes to a code of conduct, that gives you some guidance on what's right and what's wrong, what you should or shouldn't do in coaching. But I think it's only helpful as far, right? It can offer some guidance. It gives you a bit of an idea. It draws a bit of a landscape. But once we're in the messiness of everyday coaching scenarios, it can get tricky. So I think thinking of ethics as a set of questions you need to ask yourself rather than a set of rules to follow is super helpful, because that makes coaching a continuous inquiry. And that's why, I've been flying the flag for supervision, and I'm enjoying the coaching lab so much, because you get to dive into these situations and reflect and explore why certain decisions were made. And I love asking questions that invites a coach to consider why they have made certain decisions when, back to the Carol quote, maybe they hadn't even thought about that was a decision. Maybe they hadn't recognized that they were making choices here. They just kind of intuit from one moment to the next, as we often do as coaches. So slowing down, maybe rolling the tape back a little bit and thinking about, what have I done there? What am I left with? What choices do I make? Where did these choices come from? The more we do that, the more we create a foundation of ethics as a coach. Maybe even work on a set of ethical principles that we follow. And that makes us so much stronger and so much more confident as coaches. And the quality of the space that we hold when we are grounded in that kind of framework, in that kind of principled set, it's very powerful. And there's an ease and a groundedness and a quality of space that is just lovely to be in the presence of. So I think it serves our clients and all the stakeholders in coaching. And
Absolutely.
Don't get me going, right?
Yeah, no, I think it's terrific, and those are definitely, words of wisdom. And before I move on to what was sparked, I do want to say that if coaches have not been ever in supervision, it is such an amazing place to be, and to find out more about yourself, and to have people who are aligned with you, whether it's, one-to-one supervision or in a group supervision. Really important for coaches to be able to step into that. And that's something that I had never even thought about until I started with teams. But individual coaches, co-coaches, team coaches, definitely. So I'm just making a plug for supervision because it's important.
Yes, we need many more plugs for supervision. That's also one of
Yes.
those things where I'm like, wow, how can this not be on the radar of every single
Yeah,
coach? But, different cultures. And
that's
also,
right.
that's why I've been so happy to see the work. And I think this is how we connected, right? Through the Coaching Ethics Forum. Because the work that Wendy and Smith, for example, David Clutterbuck, a number of others have done a lot in this space. And Wendy's been telling me it's been exploding in popularity, right? They put on a conference and they had like hundreds of people running their door in, where before, just a couple of years back, would have been like 60, 70, 80, and now there's a whole global community that engages not just each other, but also a much wider community of coaches in ethical reflection. So a couple of new
Absolutely.
books on the market, there's communities out there, there's reflective spaces, lots more supervision, drop-in sessions. So there's plenty of opportunities to really hone in on your ethical framework. And I hope that a lot more coaches follow that call.
What are you finding in supervision, or just in your day-to-day, even you as a coach, are some maybe things that people aren't thinking about that are ethical decisions, or things that maybe can position a coach into a better ethical position with their coaching practice?
Yeah, so there's a lot, right? So um, some some things. The first thing that came to my mind was it it's true. Things that we often don't think about. For example, I've heard some coaches talk about writing a recommendation, or I've had an interesting situation the other day where a coach had asked me whether I could. They applied for an award, and they wanted me to confirm that I'm their supervisor. And then I got a whole form that basically asked me to write a recommendation for them, or a little statement of why I think they deserve the award,
Mm.
which it's not what I had signed up for. And it was a bit tricky. And I think many coaches may not think about that twice and just like, of course, I'm going to recommend them because I value them as a coach, and I do value them as a coach. But I thought it was a potentially a tricky situation because now I'm in another role and I'm kind of leaving my role as a supervisor and I'm tuning in through a different lens. And if I do it for this person, would I not have to do it with all other people?
That's right.
A recommendation on LinkedIn, a request for a recommendation on LinkedIn, or a testimonial of some sort, asking for an introduction with someone. I know plenty of coaches, I don't think twice about, of course, I'm going to introduce you to everybody, but like that can also be tricky. There's so much more at play here. The dynamics might slightly change. You run a supervision group or a coaching group, and one member of the coaching group reaches out to you outside of the group and starts a somewhat different relationship. A coaching client wants to get you involved in some work they're doing. Is that of course, yeah, sure. And I'm easy to navigate and handle. I'm not really having any concerns. But, have you thought about the implications of leaving, the agreed coaching space? At which point do you need to recontract? At which point do you, just super simple, clients asking for some advice and you happen to have some good advice. But the agreement was for a more facilitative coaching style where you hold space. So if you just were to just give the advice, then you change something in the dynamics now.
Right.
And if that advice doesn't work out, then it's on you, or at least you bear some responsibility. And if the advice does work out, they don't fully own the results. So is that something you think about? Many coaches will. Some coaches won't. So there's all of these kind of situations that they have many, many layers. And I found that if you start tuning into the layers of the decisions that you make, you always go deeper on what your ethical principles are, what your ethical code is. It doesn't mean that something is unethical, that, you acted wrongly if there are some concerns that you hadn't thought about. But I think it's helpful. Some might say now, well, you do too much. Do we need to think about everything at that level of depth? And I guess some of it is a fair concern because we want to remain able to be agile in the moment and move and follow our intuition. So it can also be a bit in the way of a fluid coaching conversation. But that's why I guess we have spaces like supervision or reflective spaces for an individual coach afterwards. I had a colleague who said, I asked him where that intervention came from. He talked to me about having made an intervention, and it seemed unorthodox. And I said, well, where did that come from? Like, what was operating in the background? Like I often do in the lab as well, right? And he said, I often have no clue where my interventions come from. That's what the supervision is for. I'd like try to make sense of it afterwards. Like, where was that grounded and where did that question come from? Or, was that right? Did I not think about something? So, I mean, he was drawing on 20 years of practice. And it's a bit easier to just follow your intuition. But I know a lot of people who follow their intuition quite blindly and never really take time to question their intuition because they trust it so much. And I think some of it can be potentially harmful. But I believe that whenever we reflect on why we do the things we do and why we have done the things we've done, we become more grounded practitioners.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, and yes. All right. Well,
I feel like I'm throwing so much stuff at you. I think maybe I need to get a couple of gears down and take some breaths.
Good. No, it's good because it's important information. And this gives the listener time to take a pause and really reflect, if you will, on the words that you're saying and aligning that, okay, is it aligned with what I do? And really asking themselves the question as they're listening. And that's what this is about. So it's important. So no, you're great. Yeah, but I would love to switch gears and go into this coaching lab. Tell us about this coaching lab that you have founded. Come on, bring it on.
Well, so where do I start? Well, I think to just make this as valuable as possible, right? I think what was missing was to really connect theory to practice. I love theory, but I have heard coach after coach after coach say, when I asked them, hey, what was the most valuable part of whatever practice training you've just experienced? And the overwhelming majority tends to say, well, it was actually seeing somebody who's experienced in this do it, right? There's this desire of, well, I want to know how it's done. And I think most coaches in training, they get to see a lot of their peers coach, and they get to coach a lot of their peers, but everybody's just starting out. And then there's maybe a short demo by an experienced trainer, but it's a very artificial kind of setting. And everybody's a coach, and it's often quite kind of softball coaching sessions, and everybody just looks at what's the positive, and everybody's new to this. So it's difficult to be critical from a position of not knowing anything about what's going on there. So what do? I went to YouTube and other places to just see what's out there. And most of it is kind of disappointing. So often you learn a lot from a coaching session that isn't done well, or where it just doesn't really work. And sometimes we have that in the coaching lab too. It's a lab for a reason, right? But I think it's that reflective space afterwards. And I kind of ties it back in with supervision and reflective practice and ethics, So I wanted to have somebody coach for a whole session, 45 minutes. Could argue that longer would probably be useful, but also the event is already 3 hours long. So full session, let's call it that, 45 minutes, and then have another 45 minutes to really take it apart, to be critical. I like being critical. Maybe it's my German roots, but like I like to believe I'm gentle, but also inquisitive. I think the most elegant way to challenge someone is curiosity. And I'm really curious about, where the hell did that question come from? What theoretical model, if any, was operating in the background? What was going on during that silence? It's like, how did you experience that silence, client? Now, like, I got the feeling that you got a bit annoyed at this moment with the coach or with the question. I don't know what it was. Like, do you remember that moment? What was going on for you? So
good.
Would you share your notes? What did you write down? This is so you really get an inside look under the hood of what experienced coaches do. And I think that's so rare, right? We then go practice, play out a new technique, try something out, even as a very experienced coach. Like, when do you get to try something out, an experiment? Like, maybe not with a paid client, especially if you're at a level where you get paid quite well. Maybe you don't want to try out the strength model that you've just learned about in a CPD. Maybe that feels inappropriate to try it with a new client. You're not quite confident with it, or, everybody has that with a new model, new approach. It feels clunky at the beginning. Then you internalize it. But it takes some time to try some new things out. So I tell all the coaches that come to like CPDs, even very experienced one, where I just get a practice client. But I have a feeling that very, very few actually get a practice client for free or for a very low cost, with the understanding that I'm going to try some things out and I haven't tried before. I think people don't really do that. And so having a space where you can just try something out, see how it lands. And if the whole thing explodes or does nothing, then sometimes we learn the most. That's where the science lab character comes from. Sometimes in an experiment, we make sense of why nothing happened. And that's how we learn. Yeah. Right. So never quite know what's going to happen in the lab, but we're going to see someone do a thing. I even moved away from do your thing, because it implies that coaches have a thing, and I think some coaches do. They have a niche, they have an approach or a methodology, but most coaches, I find, especially at experienced levels, they adapt to what the client needs in that moment. Then
yes,
I get asked to demo existential coaching, but then sometimes I start talking to a client and we have a conversation, and there's an existential lens I'm bringing, but it's not really existential coaching because it's not what they need right now. So we had a somatic coaching session, and the client said they wanted to go into their body and work with it. But in practice, they just didn't do that. Every time the coach gently invited them to pay attention to what's going on in their body, they went straight to a cognitive level. And so they didn't really push them into the body because that felt unethical to the coach. So after a couple of gentle invitations, they just went with the client. And that turned out not to be a somatic coaching session. And just making sense of what just happened. What the hell just happened? It was really eye-opening, and you learned so much about the coach's ethical stance, how they made decisions, when to push, when not to push. What kind of techniques they had considered that weren't even spoken or invited. So you can tell, right? I love I love getting to see people coach, that I talk about coaching very much, but I don't actually have a clue about what's it actually look like when somebody who wrote this beautiful book is actually in a room doing the thing. And that's what I wanted to give people a platform, because it's rare, it's really intimate. It's such a privilege.
Wow.
Mainly for me, I think I'm probably the most excited about this because
Well, there's
when
nothing wrong with that. You need to be passionate
Mhm.
about what you're bringing into the world, and that radiates to others. And so I think it's fantastic. When did you start this? The
Oh,
coaching?
we started. Well, the vision was to be in a small London theaters. I was living in London at the time, and the vision was that we're going to be in a small theater. There's lots of them, and many of them have capacity. And then at some point, the stage lights would go off, and the audience lights would come on, and we would have a conversation about what just happened. And so we wanted to start that January 2020, and then we moved the launch out to March 2020. And as people will remember at this point, or anyone in the future, that was high pandemic time. Everything closed down. So
Yes.
we've been online ever since. And I like it, to be honest. I'm kind of glad that it happened like that. I still want to do in-person events. But on Zoom, you can just have the audience disappear.
Mhm.
And after a few seconds or minutes, usually the coach and client completely forget that it's there.
Yes.
And so, you really get to an as real as possible, given the audience setting, coaching session, where it feels like two people on Zoom, they're having a conversation. And if it's in a theater, it's always going to feel a little staged.
Staged in the theater. I get that.
Indeed. Yeah, right. It kind of comes with the territory.
It does. Yeah, there's some risk that's involved in stepping into that, I imagine. Just thinking about that.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be a lot more uncomfortable. For example, we weren't recording the first couple of sessions because I felt like now we have a huge vault, like it's important
Mhm.
resource. But like I was like, no way, because I want people to feel as comfortable as possible so that, we get to see as real coaching as possible. So I'm like, let's not record. And then at some point we found some ways in which we can give coach and client an opportunity to just veto the recording going out, which occasionally happens.
Mhm.
But like I thought people would be a lot more hesitant to step into such a vulnerable space and really open up, and they would be a lot more protected. And so, that's why I didn't consider recording, because I didn't want them to be protected.
Right.
I didn't want them to feel
Want to
protected.
feel
Obviously,
right.
yeah,
Yes.
they're protected
Yeah.
by the contracting that we have in place and the
Mhm.
confidentiality agreement with the group, and all this, it's still contained, right? But as soon as the audience disappears, people really get into it, and I'm amazed and really grateful for the kind of openness that people come into the lab with, and that they allow other coaches to learn from the encounter that they're having with a coach. It's
Right.
obviously also a fantastic opportunity to work with somebody who might sometimes have decades of experience for
Mhm.
a free session that otherwise might have cost thousands of dollars. So I think there's also value in there for the client. And some
Oh,
really feed off the
absolutely.
energy of the group. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, this is exciting, and maybe there's a voyeuristic element or two to be seen, in this world where everybody seems to be seen, but it still can feel very
Mhm.
anonymous to so many people. So I think there's wider societal aspects of this that could be interesting to
Yeah.
tune into.
No, that's exciting work you're doing. For sure. And how does that take place? And we'll be sure to put that in the show notes. People can connect with you and you'll give us that information at the end and we can pop it in the show notes. But just to be clear, is it a membership that people, is that what
Yeah, so we
you
we
called it?
we started with individual tickets. We did establish a membership model, and so members have access to the recordings, which I think is a huge
Mhm.
part of the value.
Yeah.
And also that allows us, we are a very small operation, right? It's me and a couple of freelancers that work with me,
Mhm.
that help me with administration and logistics. You can imagine it's a lot, right? So this is
Yes.
not a moneymaker. Hopefully we get it to a stage where we can run several labs a week, perhaps. I could do them every day.
And how often are they?
At the moment, they're once a month, every first Tuesday.
Okay. Mhm.
And I'd love to get to a point where we can run specialized labs. At the moment, you get to see such a broad range of what coaching can be. And it really expands the idea of what coaching is, right? Because coaches work so differently. I mean, some just really lean into the mentoring or consulting element or psychoeducation. And so we have some coaches who really just move into a teaching mode and just own that, because really
Mm.
there's no rules about what you can and cannot do in coaching. So, ethics come back here.
Right. Yeah. And
Others,
and the whole contracting, as you said earlier, or
yeah,
recontracting, and that
I
can
know.
happen on the spot.
Oh yeah, some contract a lot in the beginning, and others just dive straight in. So it's always fascinating to me to what extent people do or do not contract at all. And you know,
Mhm.
if you have somebody very experienced, like some of them, I ask them questions and they hadn't considered it, but usually they know what they're doing. They're doing it intentionally. So it's really interesting. So sometimes we had sessions that I'm like, well, that was a therapy session, wasn't it? What made this coaching? And to see the different perspectives on the line between coaching and therapy, or coaching and
Mhm.
mentoring, or consulting, or teaching, or just being a friend, or just
Yes.
guiding someone through a meditation. So we've seen all of the styles, which is great. So, I always want to keep that going. But I'd love to have an existential coaching lab, just 12 existential coaches over a year, really hone in on the craft, positive psychology coaching, leadership coaching,
Yeah.
performance coaching, nutrition coaching. There's a
Mhm.
million different kinds of coaching.
I
And so you
see
could
that
really
growing.
get the community together, of that particular community of practice, right? Is a word I got introduced to a little while ago. And I love that as a framework for it. A community of coaches that comes together, who are committed to working at the top of their game, who are
Mm.
committed to growing and expanding their practice. Now, the idea of how it's practiced. And I think if we bring niche coaches together, it has a special energy. At
Yes.
the moment, we bring coaches together that just love to expand their idea of coaching. You always pick up a new technique or something from any coach that you watch live. But yes, that's where I see it going. And for that, a membership system just really works, because then we're not so
Yeah.
busy marketing every event.
Right.
People commit to being a part of that community of practice.
Mhm. That is fantastic. Well, we're going to shift again because you've used the word, and I know that
Mhm.
your education is around existentialism, and so I'd love for you maybe to just unpack what that is, because I know that some of the listeners, they may say yes, maybe they've heard it, maybe they haven't. So, what
Mhm.
is existentialism, and what is that when we look at that through the coaching lens?
Mm. I always have to smile a little bit when I think existentialism in a nutshell, because it's
I
it's
do.
com- yeah, it's complex. I think I'd like to believe over the years I kind of got okay at narrowing it down to the essential of what it is. So, essentially, existentialism as a branch of philosophy, it's a philosophy of human lived existence, of the experience of existing, the experience of being human, right? Being human as well. What do we know about being human when we strip all of the kind of labels away, right? When you just think about being there, that's what, yeah, Heidegger, Sartre, Albert Camus, there's Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche. There's a lot of these philosophers that started thinking about, what does it mean to just be there? Not be a coach, not be German or American, not be right wing, left wing, Republican, Democrat. Like, if you strip all of that away, man, woman, like parent, what's left when you're just there? That's the human condition. And the human condition is characterized by anxiety, not the kind of anxiety that you get maybe ahead of a presentation or public speaking gig, but the existential anxiety, the anxiety that you get as a result of just being human in a world with other humans. Now, it's characterized by certain tensions, by certain conflicts that nobody can escape unless they stop existing or they continuously keep themselves busy and distract themselves from the human experience, right? You have that people after, 20 years of work, they're like, oh, who am I now? Whatever, where did all of this time go? Just keep busy. So if when we become still, sometimes we notice it bubbling up and then often we distract ourselves with something. So for example, we like to not think about endings, temporality, death as perhaps the ultimate ending, at least as far as we can know things. With what you believe is about what comes after death or not. I know I'm talking to someone with a particular perspective on this, but it doesn't matter so much what you believe comes after. What we know is that it's a significant ending, perhaps the most significant endings of all.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's just black, or maybe there's some sort of paradise, maybe there's some sort of afterlife, but it is a significant change in human experience. And endings are everywhere. It's not just death, but everything is temporal. We always move into different phases. Every change process requires an ending and a new beginning. So endings are part of the fabric of human existence, and we need them because deadlines help us to get shit done. And so many people rely on them, but also they cause some anxiety. We don't really want to focus on things ending, especially when they're nice, but it offers meaning and purpose to our life. It does something. So we have this paradoxical relationship with endings. Same thing with relating to other people. Sartre wrote that hell is other people. We naturally compare ourselves to others, but we're social animals. We need the group. We couldn't survive without the group. So we love the group, we hate the group, we need the group, and it's causing us so much pain and suffering. So it's both, and it's paradoxical, it's tension, but we feed off that tension. Absurdity, meaninglessness, it's a third kind of existential given. If there is a meaning of life, we couldn't know. We can have faith, but we can't know it.
Right.
We can create meaning in our life. We can choose things to be meaningful. We can create meaning in suffering. But an overarching meaning to our existence, the best we can do is believe in it. So existentialists have argued that, well, there's absurdity in life that is just one of the givens. There's meaninglessness. We cannot make sense of certain things, at least not with certainty. So that's part of the human existence. We are meaning-making machines. We always make meaning. We always make sense of things quite naturally. Right. But we cannot ever be sure whether that's correct meaning. So many different meaning structures. What I believe is right, somebody else thinks is despicable. What saved the children from cancer? Are you crazy? Have you thought about overpopulation? Okay. Some people say we need war and destruction because that is a natural way of balancing out the production. So, it's important that we're fighting. Like, I'm not sure I think about that, but I could see the argument. So, and then freedom. Freedom is often hailed as this uber positive thing that everybody should be striving for. But you give someone way too much freedom, and they're going to experience what Søren Kierkegaard, one of the first people who wrote about existentialism, Danish philosopher, talks about as the dizziness of freedom. Very simple experiment that was done once. You're in the supermarket, you offer people a free marmalade, free jam. Right? You offer them 3, people leave happy. You offer them 23, and many leave. The majority leaves with, oh, there could have been a better choice. Oh, have I chosen correctly? Have I made the most out of this opportunity? Oh, they can't. I've been to a supermarket once wanting to buy cereal and left without buying a cereal because I didn't want to go through the choice. I think most of us have been there. despairing over what to pick from the lunch menu because
Yes.
you can never
Too many
ever go back.
choices.
You can
That's
never go
right.
back and make a different choice at that moment in time. So every choice excludes all the other opportunities, all the other choices. You can only choose one out of the gazillion choices that you have. And think about choosing a romantic partner or a job or a career, where to study, or, so huge choices, small choices. There's always existential anxiety if you pay attention to it. Right. So,
because you've got to own it. You've got to own your choice.
yes. And you need to come to terms with never finding out whether a different choice would have been better or worse, or just different. You will never, ever know because you can never go back and make the other choice. So absurdity, freedom, death, isolation, that's kind of been framed as the existential givens, what characterizes the human condition. And existential coaches learn to listen to their clients' relationship with these givens, and I think in that, when we listen to that, when we pick it up, and it can be very subtle, or it can be very much in your face, right? I've learned in my coaching practice that whatever a client brings into the coaching room, the presenting issue, if you will, it's always connected to one or more of these existential themes, of these bigger questions in life. Why am I here for? What am I doing with my time? Is there a God? What does he, she, it want me to do? What's my purpose? How can I live a meaningful existence? How can I be happy? There's big questions in life that don't have one answer. They have many answers, possibly, but people need to find their answer. And there's no certainty whether that's the right answer. Yeah. So these bigger questions, they're always there underneath the surface. And sometimes they're very much in your face. And so as an existential coach, I like to make those connections because it opens up different conversations than if I were to just jump on what the presenting issue is and let's create a goal and an action plan out of that, or
Very interesting. Very interesting. So that it seems to me that would be a very rich coaching conversation as you process through those things, for sure.
Yeah, it can be, right? I mean, now I'm quite branded as an existential coach, right? I talk about it quite a lot. So I think that heightens the tendency that somebody comes to me with a big question to start off with.
Yeah.
And we have sometimes a philosophical discussion about what does it mean to be authentic as a leader or as a parent or as a friend, have a conversation about dilemma and paradox and tension, conflict. But I've done quite a lot of work with an agency, for example, in New York, working with a lot of kind of tech startups at the East Coast, at the West Coast, and there's a lot of people coming in. They're not interested in a philosophical debate. They're not interested in any philosophical concepts, and we never mention anything existential. But these are human issues. They're always in the room. Questions around belonging, for example. It's almost always in the room in some way or another.
Yes.
And sometimes it's the client's dominant conflict. And it influences all of these things that they bring into the coaching room, even if they have never mentioned the term belonging. I'm quite big picture, so I pick up on some of these broader themes. And with an existential lens and a big picture lens, I can invite a conversation about a bigger theme. But that's not necessarily necessary, I can also just notice them. And if it keeps coming back, I'll put it on the table and probably invite a conversation about it. But, I'm not making every conversation existential because it's not needed. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes you do an existential coaching demo and you set out to have an existential conversation and it just doesn't go that way. And because, how much time do you have and what do you want to achieve? If it's something that is quite tangible and the client wants to have that conversation, well, there's probably other clients that I might be a bit more excited about. But, if we're together and as the existentialists invite us, just commit to the thing that you're doing now. If something's boring, as soon as you commit to it, it just stops being boring, So not every existential coach has philosophical conversations. It just means that it's a lens that offers more possibility to have different kinds of conversations. And not every systemic coach will talk openly about influences of the system, but we always notice them.
Right.
Right.
And
So it
that
just
goes
adds more.
right for Christian coaches. Now, if I'm with a client who is Christian and they're open to exploring that avenue, that's fine, but I'll still use the same principles of Christianity with a corporate client. It's the same thing.
Mhm.
I'm not verbalizing with a Christian lens. So I get that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Wow.
one thing that's probably worth mention to maybe predominantly Christian audience is that existentialism sometimes gets a reputation of being full of atheists.
Mm.
And there's probably a trend towards, when you hear nothingness and absurdity at the center of the human experience, I'm sure it would rub a lot of Christians the wrong way, and they're like, yeah, but really. And actually, there's been quite a lot of existentialists who come from theism, who had a very strong personal relationship with God. I think all existentialists, they're critical towards dogma, right? So they would encourage people to question where your beliefs are coming from, right? And evaluating stories that you have just been handed down and build your own relationship with them. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stop believing in God. It just means that,
Right.
oh, maybe you're going to break with organized religion. So that's what Søren Kierkegaard, for example, that happened. He broke with the church, but he was a devout Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a whole book, Christian Existentialism. It's a very good book for anybody who's listening to this that has that kind of lens. But I like the philosophy because it it everybody who's human seems to really get it, because it's about the human
Mm-hmm.
experience.
Right.
But it doesn't tell you this
Yes.
is a right or wrong way to live. It just
Mm-hmm.
means, it just invites us and encourages us to question, to doubt, to be critical, to create your own thing. Even if you are critical and you're doubting and you're questioning, and then you arrive exactly where you left off. At least now it's sunken in and you've challenged it and you decided that this is something I can own, and the experience of having gone through a process like that doesn't necessarily mean you're making a lot of changes in your life, but it means now the experience is one where you really own your life and your decisions, and you
Mm-hmm.
own the risk. You take a responsibility for
That's
the
right.
choices that you make, rather than life happening to you. You're now there in this, you're the
Mm.
captain. And
That's
some
right.
things there, we call it facticity. You can't choose which language you're going to grow up with. You can't choose some of your physical features. I mean, you can choose a lot of physical features nowadays.
Nowadays, yes.
Modern surgery. But there's certain things you just can't change.
Mm-hmm.
And coming to terms with that is really helpful. So what can I change? What can I not change? Um, and then owning responsibility for our choices. What have I chosen? What have I chosen not to choose? Where have I chosen to not take any action? Where have I chosen to sit back and see how things play out? That's a
Mm-hmm.
choice. So,
Mm-hmm.
so you chose not to choose. And just that
Yeah.
frame is really helpful. And to me, it helped I could take all of these coaching tools, interventions, questions, lines of inquiry, models, and integrate them into an existential grounding, right? Because existentialism offers a way of understanding my relationship with myself and with the world and with others. And within that, it's quite fertile ground to draw in my positive psychology background, for example,
Yes.
or draw in something from psychodynamic, or draw in something from TA, or a systemic we mentioned, or there's so many coaching approaches out there. It's compatible with quite a lot of them, and in conflict with some others. Um, but I love that as a foundation because I feel at home there, and it allows me, it's solid enough to work as a foundation, and it's flexible enough to allow me to evolve.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for just unpacking that at the level you did. So it's understandable for people to to not just hear the word, but to have a better understanding about what it is and how they can connect with that. So thank you for that. Well, Yannick, I would love to be able to point people to you. How can people connect with you? Maybe they've heard something today. Maybe they've heard about that coaching lab and they want to check that out, or just learn more about you and the services that you provide. How can we point them in your direction?
Sure. So coaches can ideally go to rocketsupervision.com. I could go into rocket metaphor. I love that as well. But, rocketsupervision.com, as you would spell it, is my hub for coaches with all the resources. There's also a link to the coaching lab, or you can go to gocoachinglab.com directly. And my other work I do with non-coaches, so to speak, is at existential.coach. So www.existential.coach. And find me on YouTube, LinkedIn. I'm out there if you Google me.
Okay. And then where can people find your book?
Oh, an introduction to existential coaching. I think it's on all major bookstores. Routledge is
Okay.
a
Very
pretty
good.
spot on publisher, so
Yep.
you have no problem finding that.
Okay, good. Very good. We'll make sure that those go in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Conversations today. It's been a rich conversation. I learned some things and I appreciate that. And I love that we kind of went around the block with quite a bit of information during this session. So thank you for that. Brilliant.
Kelly, thank you so much for the platform. Really appreciate you being here. And I feel there's so many questions that I could ask you. So I think we might need to have another one of these because I feel there's a lot more that you could offer in response or in dialogue, and coaches love dialogue. So
Yes,
sometimes I
they
fall
do.
into this interview mode where you give me the right question and I mean, you just witnessed it. I just kind of go for a while,
Yeah.
especially when it's a complex concept.
Yeah, it is a complex concept, but you were able to break it down, and I appreciate that. It's important, especially for this platform, for people not to, things can be pretty lofty. And so it's important, the work that I do. I'm a very simple person. I don't use big words. I like things broken down so I can understand them and then I can explain them better to other people. So I appreciate you. And until next time, you keep doing great things and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
You're welcome.